Imagine this, a single, rain-soaked day in June of 1815. The entire fate of Europe is hanging in the balance. You've got two of the greatest generals in all of history, Napoleon Bonaparte and the Duke of Wellington, staring each other down across a muddy field in Belgium. The battle that's about to unfold will end a 20-year war and literally draw the map for the next century. Okay, let's get into it.
So, our story doesn't actually begin on the battlefield. It starts with what has to be one of the most incredible comebacks in history, the return of the Emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte.
You see, after he was defeated back in 1814, Napoleon was exiled to this tiny little island called Elba. Everyone thought that was it for him. But on February 26, 1815, he just escapes. He lands in France with only a handful of men and starts this legendary march to Paris, basically gambling everything on the idea that the French people would flock to his side.
And this quote, wow, it just shows you the sheer force of his personality. So, at a place called Laffrey, troops that the king had sent to arrest him are blocking his path. Instead of fighting, Napoleon just walks right up to them, throws open his coat, and says these words. Can you imagine the guts? The soldiers, totally overcome, just started cheering "Long live the Emperor" and joined him on the spot. Legendary stuff. With more and more soldiers joining him, Napoleon strolls into Paris on March 19th without a single shot being fired. This kicks off his second rule, what we now call the 100 Days. But the other big powers in Europe, we're talking Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, they were absolutely not having it. They declared him an outlaw and started getting their armies together immediately. A war wasn't just possible, it was inevitable.
Now, Napoleon was a brilliant strategist. He knew he couldn't just sit around and wait for this massive coalition to invade France from all sides. No way! His only shot was to strike first, hit them fast, and hit them hard. The plan? Knock out the Allied armies on his border one by one. And so, the race to Belgium was on.
This right here, this quote perfectly captures the moment Wellington realized he'd been completely outplayed. Picture this. It's the night of June 15th, and he's at this glamorous high society ball in Brussels. And then the news hits. Napoleon's already crossed the border and is moving fast. You can just imagine the panic. The party screeched to a halt as officers scrambled to get back to their men.
So, 2 days before the main event at Waterloo, you get these two crucial simultaneous warm-up acts. Over on the left, at a crossroads called Quatre Bras, Wellington's forces just about manage to fend off an attack. But on the right, at Ligny, Napoleon himself lands a heavy punch on the Prussian army led by Field Marshal Blücher.
Okay, now this right here is absolutely critical. After getting beaten at Ligny, everybody, including Napoleon, expected the Prussians to retreat east, back towards their homeland. But they don't. In a game-changing decision, their commanders decide to retreat north, staying roughly parallel to Wellington's army. This kept them in the game, and it meant they could eventually march to help Wellington. You could argue this one decision sealed Napoleon's fate.
And now we get to the battle itself. It's the morning of June 18th, 1815. It had rained torrentially all night, so the battlefield is a sea of mud. Two huge armies are facing each other, and the stage is set for an absolutely brutal, day-long slugfest. Wellington was an absolute master of defensive warfare, and this map shows his genius at work. See that ridge? He placed most of his army on the other side of it, the reverse slope, which protected them from French cannon fire. And then, out in front, he fortified these three farmhouses, Hougoumont, La Haye-Sainte, and Papelotte, to act as these tough little breakwaters that would just chew up the French attacks. Okay, so the clock starts ticking around 11:30 a.m. Napoleon opens with what was supposed to be a diversionary attack on the farmhouse of Hougoumont. Then, around 1:30, the main event begins. He unleashes his grand battery, 80 cannons all firing at once, followed immediately by a huge infantry assault aimed right at Wellington's center. This was the first major crisis of the day for Wellington. We're talking a staggering 14,000 French infantrymen, a whole army corps, marching up that muddy hill. They actually managed to push back the first line of defenders, and for a terrifying moment, it really looks like Wellington's center is about to completely collapse. But in response, Wellington unleashes his own trump card. 2,000 British heavy cavalry. You can almost hear the roar of Scotland forever as these guys, including the famous Scots Greys, thunder down the slope. They just smash into the French columns, shattering them and sending them reeling back down the hill. It was an absolutely spectacular, decisive charge.
But here's where heroism turned into a disaster. The charge worked, but the cavalry got carried away. They had zero discipline. They just kept going all the way up to the French cannons. By then, their forces were exhausted, their formations were a mess, and they were sitting ducks. A French counterattack just cut them to ribbons. So in a few short minutes, Wellington had stopped the main French attack, but he'd lost most of his best heavy cavalry to do it. A huge loss.
So, with those first major attacks beaten back, the battle now enters its most desperate phase. For the next few hours, the field of Waterloo just becomes this scene of non-stop attack and desperate defense. Both armies are being pushed to their absolute limits.
Around 4 o'clock, Marshal Ney, Napoleon's fiery commander, sees Allied casualties being moved to the rear and makes a colossal mistake. He thinks they're retreating. So in this moment of epic misjudgment, he launches one of the biggest cavalry charges in history, something like 9,000 horsemen, straight at an infantry line that wasn't broken at all.
So how on earth do you stop 9,000 horsemen? Well, you do this. Wellington's infantry quickly formed into these things called infantry squares. It's basically a hollow box of soldiers with bayonets pointing out on all 4 sides. It's a wall of steel. Horses just won't charge it. So this massive wave of cavalry just washed around the squares like water around rocks, completely unable to break them. Now, while all that cavalry chaos was happening, 2 other critical fights were going down. In the center, there was this brutal hand-to-hand fight for the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte, which was draining Wellington's army. And then, and this is huge, over on the French right flank, the first of the Prussians finally arrived. They immediately started attacking the village of Plancenoit, putting serious pressure on Napoleon's rear. The clock was ticking.
The sun is starting to set. Wellington's line is stretched so thin it's about to snap. The Prussians are hammering the French flank. Napoleon knows it's now or never. He decides it's time to play his final card.
This is it, the moment of truth. Napoleon commits his very last reserve, the absolute elite of his army, the Imperial Guard. These guys were legends, the best soldiers in Europe, veterans who had supposedly never been beaten in battle. They start their advance up the slope in one final desperate push to break the Allied line for good.
The Guard actually pushes back the first units they hit, but then they run into a fresh brigade of British foot guards who had been lying down hidden on the reverse slope. The British stand up, unleash these devastating volleys at point-blank range, and stop the Guard dead in their tracks. Wellington, seeing the invincible Guard hesitate for the first time ever, stands up in his stirrups, waves his hat, and signals a general advance for his entire army. This was the moment.
You cannot overstate the psychological shock of this moment. Seeing the Guard actually retreating was unthinkable. And the cry, "La Garde recule, sauve qui peut," the Guard is retreating, every man for himself. It just spread like wildfire through the French army. And just like that, the morale that it held up all day long just shattered. The army began to dissolve into panic.
And what started as a retreat very quickly turned into a complete rout. The battle was over. All that was left was the brutal, chaotic chase and the final end of an emperor's dream.
With the French army now in a full-blown panic, the fresh Prussian cavalry took over the pursuit, hunting them down relentlessly into the night. It was a total collapse. They captured everything: equipment, baggage, even Napoleon's personal carriage with his diamonds and a copy of Machiavelli's The Prince still inside.
Let's just pause on the human cost for a second. It was staggering. Across a battlefield of just a few square miles, an estimated 50,000 men and horses lay dead or wounded. It was one of the single bloodiest days of that entire era. Just unimaginable carnage. Napoleon managed to escape back to Paris, but his power had completely evaporated. The French government saw that the cause was lost and forced him to abdicate for a second and final time. He ended up surrendering to the British, who exiled him to St. Helena, a remote, windswept rock in the middle of the South Atlantic. That's where he would die, 6 years later.
The Battle of Waterloo wasn't just the end of a war. It really did usher in a new world order. The victors got together at the Congress of Vienna and redrew the map of Europe, creating a system to maintain a balance of power that, for the most part, prevented another huge continent-wide war for almost 100 years. And it leaves us with one of history's greatest what-ifs. How different would our world look today if, on that rainy June afternoon, the Imperial Guard hadn't retreated?